Things don't always turn out the way we might expect. We all know the truth of that, don't we? From some incident in our own lives or something we witnessed, things don't always turn out the way we expect. And let me give you one example from my life, or at least from somebody in my life, and it involves my late beloved father-in-law, Leo. But first you need to know something about Leo. Leo died a little over 10 years ago in his upper 80s, but he lived his entire life with this wonderful childlike curiosity and eagerness and delight. If you were to ask him on any given day how he was, he'd say, great. Not okay, not good, not fine, but great. And he lived his life in superlatives. Every pizza he ate was the best pizza he ever had. Every trip he went on was the most wonderful trip he'd ever taken. Every heavy rainstorm was the biggest storm he'd ever seen in his life. Everything was in superlatives. He was simply about the kindest, nicest human being I've ever known. Well, one day, maybe 25 years ago, Leo and my late mother-in-law, Irene, were out for a Sunday night dinner at one of their favorite restaurants. This is out in the western suburbs. And as they were sitting there, lo and behold, two of the nuns from their church came in to have dinner. Now, Leo and Irene were good old-fashioned Roman Catholics, so Leo called a waitress over and told her that he wanted to pay for dinner for the two nuns. Well, now the nuns were absolutely delighted, as were the 5 other nuns who were parking the car, as well as the elderly nun who was back home, and they were going to do takeout for her. So instead of buying dinner just for the 2 of them, Leo ended up buying dinner for 10 people. And from what I understand, the sisters were putting away the chow pretty good that night. And I was teasing him about this a little bit later, and he said, no, Jay, it wasn't what I expected. Said, but I was glad to do it. Glad to do it. Not what he expected. But it actually turned out even better. Today we have a perfect example of a moment in the lives of the disciples, and especially of Peter, that did not turn out as he expected. Think about this pivotal moment in the ministry of Jesus and in the lives of the disciples. Up to this point, in the first half of Jesus' ministry, he has been calling the disciples and others to follow him. They have watched as he has healed people afflicted with a variety of physical, spiritual, emotional infirmities. They have seen him perform acts of marvel and wonder. And as they travel in the northern district, in the area of Caesarea Philippi, Jesus, in a private moment with the disciples, takes them aside and says, what are people saying about me? Who do people say that I am? And the disciples give some of the answers that, might have been expected. Well, some say, you're Elijah come back to life. Others say that you're one of the great prophets from of old, or maybe a new prophet who has arisen. And then Jesus asks the big question, but who do you say that I am? And at that point, I like to imagine that Simon Peter experienced something that he had not expected. He had traveled with Jesus. He had given up his life in order to follow this itinerant rabbi. He had been touched by the way this man interacted with others, and surely thought he was a profoundly insightful, discerning, and wise, gifted man. But perhaps in that very moment when Jesus says to him, but who do you say that I am? Everything came together for Peter. And maybe without even knowing what he was saying, he perhaps just blurted out, you are the Messiah, the Christ, the anointed one, the Messiah, the Holy One of God. And that surely wasn't really what he expected when Jesus walked by Peter when he was fishing and said, follow me, I'll make you fish for people. So right away, in the story today, we have a moment of unexpectedness, if you will. But it goes on from there. Because what does Jesus then say? Don't tell anybody this. Because the truth is that the Son of God is going to go to Jerusalem, and there, he told his disciples, he was going to be betrayed, he was going to be put into the hands of the leadership, and he was going to be put to death, and on the 3rd day rise. And you know the story. Peter takes Jesus aside and said, God forbid, Lord, that'll never happen to you. And Peter is responded to with Jesus saying, get behind me, Satan. That's not what Peter expected either, is it? And it still doesn't end. Because Jesus then goes on to say, if you want to save your life, you have to lose it. If you want to find who you are, you have to forget who you are. You have to take up your cross and follow me. And that clearly was not what the disciples would have anticipated. We know these words. We've heard them in many cases for decades. Again and again, we've heard Jesus say, you have to take up your cross and follow me. You have to give up your life in order to find it. And unfortunately, I think this image, this metaphor of taking up our crosses has become so common that it's become trivialized. You've heard people say, maybe you've said, I know I've said, well, you know, that situation at work, that's just my cross to bear. That's not what Jesus is talking about. He's not talking about some little inconvenience. He is not talking about, you know, spending less time checking out our investments or surfing the net or watching the Bears. He's not talking about giving up chocolate during Lent. Those are not crosses to bear. Instead, what he's saying is that there needs to be a dramatic, a radical reorientation of our lives, our priorities, our commitments, our dedication. And all because of the paradoxical truth that the more we hold on to something, the less we actually have of it. The more we try to clutch onto something, the more elusive it becomes. We live in a fearful and frightening world so much of the time, and our lives are filled with all sorts of obligations and commitments and anxieties. And the temptation is to succumb to living a life of fear where we are afraid of death, afraid of losing, afraid of not having enough. But that kind of life ultimately means we end up with a fearful life, doesn't it? It's not just that we're afraid of death, we end up being afraid of life. And we are tempted to pull down the curtains on the windows, to build the wall higher around ourselves, to be very careful about what we let in and whom we allow access to our lives, thinking that if there's only so much to go around, I gotta hold on tightly to what I got. But the paradox of Jesus' words and of his very own life example is the more we offer life, the more we receive it. The more we give away love, the more that love is replenished. Anybody here who has had a child or a grandchild, you may think to yourself, how can I love somebody more than I love my spouse? And then that child is born, and you discover that there's more love where that love came from. And then the second child comes along and you think, well, what if I don't like this guy as much as I like the first one? And then the third maybe? But what happens? Enough love flows from us to fill the others. That's the truth behind Jesus' words today. He is not calling us to seek death. He is not calling us to follow him into death. He is calling us to follow him into a life worth living for his sake and for each other. And when in our own lives do we feel most alive, most vibrant, most fully ourselves? Is it when we are fearful? Is it when we are accumulating? Is it when we're clutching? Or is it when we're serving and offering? When we are loving and giving? And I know that goes against the nature of this world. The world says get. Jesus says give. The world says accumulate. Jesus says offer. Again and again, the world says follow this path to success. Jesus says follow this path to life. The more life we have, the more we give away. The more we give away, the more life we receive. Most of you know that I spent some time earlier in life as a professional singer. And all singers have to learn at some point, and I hope you all will back me up on this, that you have to stop listening to yourself. That if you listen to how you sound inside your head, that's where most of the beautiful sounds are staying. And one of the most difficult things as a young singer to learn is to trust your body and to let those beautiful sounds out instead of hearing them within your own cranium. It's a very difficult and very paradoxical reality. Am I right, guys? Okay, good, okay. But that's the truth that Jesus is pointing to today, isn't it, as well? The more we hold on, the less we have. The more we clutch, the more it reduces. And as we give away our life, as we give away our love, as we give away mercy and compassion and kindness, we find that it is replenished again and again and again. Because the simple truth is, we never run out of life. Even when our own physical lives end, God still has more life in store for us, because we are dealing here with a God who never runs out of life, and a God who never runs out of love and of mercy and of kindness and compassion. It's not what the world expects. It's not even perhaps what we expect. It certainly goes against everything that we are taught in our culture. But the more we offer, the more we are filled. The more we give, the more we receive. The more we hand off, the more we are replenished by a God who never runs out of love, by a God who never runs out of grace, by a God who never runs out of life.